Welcome. I'm Erik Peterson, Vice President of Policy here at the Afterschool Alliance. This is our second Afterschool Policy Pulse. Want to welcome you all in. I know there's still a few folks coming in from the waiting room, so we'll give it just a second. But thank you again for joining us. We're grateful for your feedback from our first issue of the Afterschool Policy Pulse last month on February 14th. We hope to continue this. We hope that this will continue to be a way for hear from you all about the successes and challenges you're facing, as well as a way we can share what's going on in Washington. And there's a lot going on in Washington these days, and how it could impact local after-school and summer programs. Again, we want to hear from you. There's a Google form that we'll post in the chat where you can send in some questions. If we time permitting, we have a lot to cover today, but time permitting, we'll answer those questions at the end of the pulse here today as we get close to 12:30. But if we run out of time, we will reach out to you by email to answer those and/or answer them during next month's pulse. The registration form also where you sign up, as a reminder, has an opportunity to ask questions. And we've incorporated addressing a couple of those into the plan for today. First off, I want to start on a positive note and say Happy Pi Day. Today is 3.14 or March 14th or Pi Day, PI Day, not PIE Day, although I invite you to join to have a slice of pie as well. But Pi Day is a reminder of how important math and science are as part of comprehensive after-school programs. Thank you for the work that you do today and every day in supporting students' math and science curiosity, but also supporting their whole child perspective in the important hours when school is out. Today is also the deadline of the current continuing resolution when the federal government spending may come to a halt at midnight if Congress doesn't act. And we'll jump into that and as we're cut to the center of the pie with what's happening now in the world of after-school policy. We're going to cover four things today and then have a few sort of things to know that may be helpful in your work as well. Again, thanks for joining us, and let's jump in with number one of the four policy happenings, and that is the fiscal year 2025 appropriations. So as a reminder, for those that didn't tune in a month ago, the annual process that Congress uses to fund the government is the appropriations process. And at midnight tonight, if Congress has not passed a spending bill or long-term legislation or a temporary spending bill determining how much to invest in federal funding, the federal government will shut down. How do we get here? So the 2025 fiscal year started back on October 1st. There was a lack of agreement between Republicans and Democrats last year around how much to spend, particularly on things like defense and non-defense. That resulted in a temporary spending measure or continuing resolution that funded the government through mid-December. There was a lot of progress, well, a medium amount of progress, not enough progress that happened in December, but that resulted in no long-term solution in terms of spending levels for fiscal year 2025. And another temporary spending measure or continuing resolution was passed, and that deadline was today, March 14th. So at 12:01 on the 15th, tomorrow, if another spending bill is not passed, we will see, again, a shutdown. Despite some progress, Republicans and Democrats still haven't reached a bipartisan plan to fund the government. There is, however, a partisan plan that a Republican plan backed by the White House that was able to pass the House of Representatives earlier this week on Tuesday evening. One Democrat voted for that plan, one Republican voted against it, but it was by far a Republican-sponsored plan. As of late last night, the 60 votes that are needed to pass that plan in the Senate appear to be there, although including several Democratic votes that are needed, although there's still a question mark as to what will happen later today. Senate Minority Leader Schumer of New York announced he would support the bill yesterday, which I think was a surprise for some people. And so that could indicate that there are enough Democratic votes to pass the bill. If there are not, then there really isn't a plan B, and that would most likely create a government shutdown after midnight tonight. Let's talk a little bit about what that spending bill is, and why there's opposition to it and why there's a lot of question marks on it. We sometimes talk about a clean continuing resolution or clean spending bill, and that would extend the current funding level, so fiscal year 2024 through the end of this fiscal year. This is not a so-called clean funding bill. There are provisions in it that create concern, particularly on the Democratic side, but for others as well. So the measure that passed the House would fund most government programs at last year's level, not all but most, through September 30th of 2025. Again, as we say in sort of policy speak, it's not a clean bill. Democrats are objecting because of the discretion it gives the administration to substitute its own priorities for funding instead of what Congress had designated in the fiscal year 2024 bill. That this bill is essentially extending the spending of. The new funding bill that may or may not pass later today would open the door for the administration to potentially withhold funding from a program of their choice or allocate that funding to a different program without getting permission from Congress. So this could impact a range of federal education programs. There are some programs, again, that were not specified their funding level in the prior spending bill that this is seeking to extend, so the fiscal year 24 spending bill. But then there were some in that bill that were specified funding levels. And programs like 21st Century Community Learning Centers, Title I, Title IV Part A, full service community schools, all of those sort of had their funding specified in the previous spending bill. So in theory, those programs should continue at that current spending, or the previous fiscal year 2024 spending level. So for 21st Century, for instance, that's $1.329 billion. That said, there is, again, a lot of leeway in this funding bill that could result in billions in cuts by the administration, including things like funding for the District of Columbia schools and other services in the District of Columbia, which is a federally impacted city. Specific to 21st Century, again, while it's less likely that those programs I mentioned, including 21st Century and Title I, because they're sort of specified in that previous bill, less likely that they could be subject to cuts. It doesn't mean that they're 100% out of the woods. And continuing to advocate, continuing to raise voices, continuing to emphasize the value and importance of all federal education support, whether it's for after school, teacher professional development, all that impacts the education of young people in this country continues to be vital. That voices are raised and voices are heard by Congress and the administration. So if the funding bill is approved by Senate and signed by the president today or tomorrow, it should, in theory, allow state education agencies to move ahead with their 21st Century grant competitions to fund after-school programs based on that $1.329 billion number, which would allow programs to be funded for the coming 25-26 school year. If the continuing resolution does not pass the Senate today and results in a government shutdown, that obviously will have impacts as well. While the funding measure that could pass, or call it the full year continuing resolution, that again does have some parameters, although a lot of flexibility, some parameters in place for the administration. A shutdown would have no parameters at all around the administration's action. So it would allow them, in the event of a shutdown, the administration to determine what parts of government remain open, what parts are eliminated. Also, under a shutdown, federal employees could be required to work for no pay. And there's no guarantees with the shutdown that Congress would have the votes to reopen the government after a shutdown were to occur. So it's a difficult decision for Senate Democrats as to, and again, only about a handful of votes are needed for it to pass. We expect that vote sometime around 1 p.m. this afternoon, and we will update our appropriations blog based on what happens. If we do end up in a shutdown, again, there is some key things to keep in mind depending on if your program receives federal education, most of the federal education funds. Most of the education funding streams like 21st Century and Title I are what we call forward funded, so they wouldn't be impacted immediately by a government shutdown. But if the shutdown were to go on for a while, they certainly would be impacted. And obviously lots of other things would be impacted, particularly AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps Vista and other pieces. So if we do end up with a shutdown, we'll have specifics on what that could look like and what impacts that would have up on the blog. If we end up with this spending bill passing later this afternoon, then the blog will reflect sort of in a little bit more detail what that could potentially mean for federally supported after school and summer learning programs as well. For now, again, reading tea leaves, it looks like the spending measure will pass, but a lot can happen between now and later this afternoon as well. And that vote expected at 1 could certainly be moved back in the afternoon, depending on what happens. So that was a lot. Again, still a lot of question marks, but hopefully clear as mud in terms of what the different scenarios might play out. The bottom line, though, on appropriations on all of this, but particularly for number 1 today on appropriations for fiscal year 2025, is keep an eye on what the administration chooses to do if this funding bill passes next week. And again, we will have updates as soon as we know, hear from them in terms of what their plans are for funding education programs and for their priorities. Let's shift to number 2, which is what's going on with the Department of Education. More challenges is the short answer. For those, again, that tuned in last month, we still didn't have a Secretary of Education. That has now changed. Linda McMahon is officially the Secretary of Education. She started her tenure with a memo to staff outlining changes and discussing the scaling back of the agency. Fast forward to this week when the department announced on Tuesday evening a reduction in force that impacted nearly 50% of the department's workforce. Since January 20th, the workforce of the department's been reduced by about 1,950 employees, including approximately 600 who accepted voluntary resignations or retirements. 1,400 were impacted by the non-voluntary reduction in force and were placed on administrative leave. That leave kicks in a week from today, Friday, March 21st. According to the department's press release, the agency, quote, will continue to deliver on all statutory programs that fall under the agency's purview, including formula funding, and then they go on student loans, Pell Grants, funding for special needs students, competitive grant making. That means, I guess, again, right now, at least in theory, funding for local after school and summer learning programs through 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which is Title IV Part B, through Title I to Title IV Part A, full service community schools, all of those are either formula funding programs or competitive grant making, and are housed within the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which did not see staff cuts as part of this overall reduction in force. There are many staff reportedly, many of the staff who were impacted by the reduction were in the Department of Office of Civil Rights and the Institute for Education Science, the Federal Student Aid Office, and others. According to the department, though, all divisions within the department are impacted by the reduction, and we do expect there to be impacts, even though, again, those formula-funded programs and offices like the one that houses 21st Century may not be directly impacted by the cuts. Certainly, a lot of the other employees and other parts of the department that they rely on for things like research and evaluation, showing promising practices, those certainly were impacted. The cuts also eliminate lawyers who ensure the department and schools are following laws and protect students, parents, and educators. State and local agencies that rely on the department for guidance or oversight or for clarification on use of certain federal funds, those will also certainly be impacted. And of course, it strips away the livelihood of more than 1,000 workers, jeopardizing their well-being of those families. So it is a challenging day, and there was a protest out in front of the Department of Education, several this week, but one this morning as well, where folks are expressing their displeasure. It's also important to note that the reduction force may not necessarily be legal. 21 Democratic attorneys filed suit this week suing the Trump administration to block those firings and to blocking the dismantling of the department. They allege that the firing of the 50% employees incapacitates the department's ability to complete its legally required functions. Moving forward, it's unclear that court case will have to work its way through the courts. When this has happened in other agencies and lawsuits have been filed, there have been appeals as well. So we anticipate, a lengthy process in terms of figuring out where this all sort of is heading. And moving forward, it's still unclear if the administration plans to issue the executive order that will propose to dismantle the Department of Education. Reportedly, that executive order has been ready to go for a while. The details of it are not public, nor is the timing, nor is if they will decide that the staffing changes and some of the other policy changes are enough, and that they don't officially need to issue an executive order announcing the dismantling. As a reminder, we talked about this last month, it's important to emphasize that officially the Department of Education is a congressionally mandated cabinet level agency, so it would take an act of Congress, including 60 votes in the Senate, to eliminate the department. The staff cuts are one way without congressional approval. The administration can sort of move to make the agency less effective. And so definitely challenging times ahead. We're trying to stay on top of these changes and trying to suss out how some of these things will directly impact federal funding for after school as well as federal funding for public education as a whole. The one thing, again, that we can all do, this will be a familiar theme today and on all these updates that we do monthly, is that you can continue to share the impact of federally funded after-school programs, the value and importance of education at the local level, what federal support is able to provide, again, whether that's IDEA or other pieces in addition to the federal after-school support. Let's transition to number 3 out of 4, and that is budget reconciliation. So again, a lot going on, and we did talk about this last month. I want to give you a quick update on where things stand with reconciliation and the potential impacts of that process as well. As a reminder, for those that aren't familiar, budget reconciliation is a special legislative process that Congress sometimes uses to advance high priority fiscal legislation. It was created by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. And it allows for expedited consideration of tax spending and debt limit legislation. Thanks to my colleagues, lots of good links in the chat, including the reconciliation blog is up there as well. My colleague Jillian does a really good job in that blog of sort of explaining what reconciliation is and what it means. The update, however, to that blog is that last month, the House and the Senate each passed their individual distinct budget resolutions. They're both very different. They were both supported only by Republican votes, so it is a partisan process. And for reconciliation to move forward, the House and Senate would have to agree on the same set of sort of spending instructions, the same resolution. And that hasn't happened yet. The Senate approach, as we mentioned last month, I believe, and as is outlined in the blog, is a sort of smaller scale down approach that really focuses on border security, doesn't have a lot of tax pieces within it, and doesn't have a lot of leeway for mandatory spending cuts, whereas the House approach is sort of the big, beautiful bill, which tries to advance a large number of the administration's priorities that were laid out in the campaign trail around, no taxes on tips and some of the other tax provisions, as well as extending the corporate tax cuts from the previous Trump administration, which will expire soon. And so that those instructions in that House version, again, different, has a lot more in terms of proposed spending cuts to pay for some of those tax provisions as well. And so that's also of concern, of course. While there are not a lot of, after school funding or even K-12 education funding that are eligible as part of that process to be cut, there is child nutrition funding that's at risk. And there are higher ed programs, so financial aid programs that are sort of under the purview of the Education Committee that could be a way they can save funds in order to spend them on some of the tax benefit programs. There is an opportunity as well in this bill, in addition to the challenges with it, around after-school friendly provisions such as the child independent tax credit that could be made refundable. It could be extended as well. So we do have an action alert, which is linked in that blog. dialogue that allows you to sort of weigh in on the reconciliation process and sort of voice support, particularly around the child independent tax credit that would help families help pay for after school and summer programming as well. Number four today is sort of on the horizon, and there's a lot in the present, but it's important to keep an eye on the future as well. We expect the president's fiscal year 2026 budget proposal soon. I suspect it'll probably be next month in April, so we'll be talking about it on the April Pulse, but it could happen in the next couple of weeks later this month as well. That would be again, the spending bill with the deadline today is fiscal year 2025, which ends September 30th. Fiscal year 2026 starts October 1st of this year and would extend for 12 months from there. We expect proposed education and other cuts within the FY26 budget proposal from the administration. There could be a direct eliminations of 21st Century Community Learning Center, of the AmeriCorps programs and Corporation for National Community Service, and a lot of other key funding streams that support the out-of-school time field, as well as public education as a whole. We're preparing now for that. I encourage you to do the same. Be ready to share stories, notes with members of Congress. Be ready to invite members of Congress and senators and their staff and local media and state and local leaders to your program. Take a look at the program site visit toolkit on our website. There's some really helpful hints around how to invite some of those policymakers to your program to really just show them what the funds are used for and show the impact, have them sit in the tiny little desks, have the snack, talk to students about why they go to after school and what they would do if that program went away and the funding went away. While there's a lot of challenges going on now, again, there is no I would argue there is no direct threat to particularly 21st Century Community Learning Center or some of those other education funding streams, but we do suspect and project that that's coming. Of course, nothing is for certain, but being prepared and ready, again, to share those stories. And there's nothing stopping you, again, from doing those site visits and sharing those stories now as well. So the key here is to make a lot of people understand in a little amount of time how vital these programs are. We did it before. The 4 proposed budgets from the Trump administration all proposed to eliminate or consolidate away 21st Century Community Learning Centers. That did not happen. We ended up with a funding increase instead of $60 million over those 4 years of the previous Trump administration. We can do that again if we all work together. It's important to note, too, when you think about how you may want to share the value of after school and 21st century programs, we have a new updated fact sheet on 21st century that came out just in the last week or two that spells out the amazing impact the federal program is having on the national level and sharing your own stories of the impact at the local level, any evaluations you have, testimonials from students or parents, equally as vital. That sort of wraps up our policy update. Want to leave you with 3 things that we'd love for you to be aware of that also may help your work at the local level and help share the stories. This week, we released the brief called A Mix of Highs and Lows for After-School Program Providers. For those who have been in the After-School Alliance orbit for a while, you'll recall that back in early 2020, we did our first program provider survey soon after the pandemic sort of shut a lot of programs down before programs reopened. It's an online survey we do in conjunction with Edge Research. This most recent version was conducted in fall and winter of 2024. The survey captured 1,200 voices representing, or 1,200 program providers representing 9,200 programs, all 50 states and DC. And we'll drop that link in the chat as well. The headline there is that it finds the after-school field is experiencing areas of improvement, such as less challenges in staffing for programs, but also struggles with overall funding and sustainability. Among a couple of the key findings, 60% of the program providers are operating at the same level or higher than they were in 2019. That's a contrast from 2021 when only 45% of providers reported operating at capacity. On the flip side, a majority of programs, 53%, have a wait list right now, and that more than 8 in 10 program providers are concerned that there's children in the community who need and want after-school after school programming but can't access it. So take a look at the provider survey. It's a good way to sort of benchmark where your program is with that as well. And if you were one of the 1,200 or so folks who filled out the survey, a huge thank you for you on that. In the chat, you'll see another survey that we have going out currently underway around cost. I'll also mention that parents right now around the country are filling out the new America After 3 p.m. survey that's in the field. That really helps us capture supply and demand nationally and at the state and local level for after school and summer programs. And we'll have the latest America After 3 findings as a result of that parent survey later this fall in conjunction with Lights On. Two other quick things to be aware of. I mentioned it a little bit ago, but I'm going to mention it again. The 21st Century Community Learning Center brief for 2025. A lot of the data in there comes from the most recent U.S. Department of Education evaluation of 21st century that was posted late last year. It really makes a great case about the impact of these funds, particularly on student engagement, on addressing chronic absenteeism and increasing student attendance. On the academic side, but also on other indicators as well as supporting parents. So take a look at that as well. And there may be things in there that you can use to help tell your story about the importance of after school. And the final thing for you today before we wrap up is one of the best weeks of the year for me and for us at the After School Alliance is Youth Voice Week. That's coming very soon from March 24th to 28th. We're going to be lifting up youth perspectives with Youth Voice Week 2025. With the federal budget cuts, as I mentioned, out there, it's particularly important to connect with our members of Congress and show them the power of after school. And the best way to do that is through the mouth of the young people who are in these programs who love and help lead these programs. So we're calling on adults and young people to contact their policymakers that week to urge them to support these programs. We'll have an action page coming up soon next week. You can join us on social media with the hashtag Youth Voice Week. We know we always have a lot of young people that really through video and otherwise and through their own words talk about how important these programs are in terms of impacting their own lives, whether it's academics or so many other things, and helping develop the skills that they need to be successful. So we look forward to that as well. That concludes our second Policy Pulse. I'm going to do a quick check for questions. If we had any through the Google form and not seeing any, I want to remind you in the chat some of the links that were on there, and we'll be following up with those as well for those that signed up. Again, we urge you to share your voice, contact Congress. We'll see you next month. Look for updates on the funding deadline as they happen today. And in the meantime, always feel free to reach out to myself or my colleagues at the After School Alliance if we can be of assistance for you. We want to hear if there are things impacting your program immediately right now. We would love to hear those and would love to elevate those with key policymakers. As we all work together to get through what are some challenging times as well. I know I just signed off, but I want to say we did have one question come in around whether we know if the staff who run 21st Century at the federal level have been let go. I hopefully mentioned that, but maybe not clear enough. 21st Century lives in the Safe and Supporting Schools section at the Department of Ed in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And that is one office where there was not staff let go. And that goes back to as a federally mandated program. Staff for programs that are federally mandated within the Department of Ed at this point, at least, are still there. So hopefully that answers that question directly. And with that, again, we look forward to seeing you next month. And always please reach out if we can be of assistance. Thank you. Happy Pi Day and hang in there.